Alright, let's see what's on the interwebs today.
Hi, I'm Mark Rutten. Welcome to Nomad Boatbuilding. I want to invite you to join me on my new series, Building the Catalina Wherry. This is a custom designed and built glued lapstrake plywood rowboat based on the New Jersey Seabright skiff. Now, along the coast of New Jersey, they used to fish for salmon in pound nets, and they used boats very similar to this to tend to those nets and harvest the catch. After that fishery closed, the boats were repurposed to lifeguarding, and they continue to be used for lifeguarding today. Now, my client was one of those lifeguards in his youth, and now he wants one of these boats to be able to go and explore the Channel Islands off of California, and in particular Catalina Island, from which this design gets its name. So please join me for building the Catalina Wherry. We're going to try out some new ideas, we're going to have fun, and I'm going to take you along for the ride.
Had enough of this joker, I got work to do.
In small boat construction, there are many ways to construct keels. Probably the oldest version is what's called a plank-on-edge keel, in which a heavy wooden plank is set on its edge, rabbets are cut into the side of it, into which planking is laid, and then the planking would be screwed or nailed to that rabbet. A lighter and probably more common configuration that we find these days is where we have a plank on edge again, but it's usually much lighter in cross section, and then there's an additional plank laid on its flat and fastened to the top. This is called an apron, hog, or keelson. The planking is then fastened to that apron, and in this case we can either nail it and clinch nail it, we could screw it, or we can even use rivets on it because the inside is exposed for us to work on, unlike with the plank on edge keel. Now, wherry construction uses just a single plank laid on its flat. It's called a plank keel, and the edges are beveled off to accommodate the planking, and then the planking would be nailed, clinch nailed, or even riveted to the inside of that. Now, this shares the same construction as dories, the difference being that a wherry will have a relatively narrow bottom compared to the dory, and a dory's bottom will be built up out of multiple planks running longitudinally. I got an inquiry a few years ago now to build a New Jersey style Seabright skiff. Seabright is a little portion of the New Jersey shoreline. This kind of boat goes by a bunch of different names, or sometimes they're referred to as a New York Bay skiff. The general category would be called a wherry. There's a really unique feature that these particular ones have, and that is the use of this boxed keel. You can see in these images here, we've got a typical transom that comes down to a stern post, but instead of a regular plank on edge keel creating a skeg in the back, we have this box configuration in which all the planking comes together at a stern post, but it creates this hollow area in here. Apparently that really helps you out in terms of keeping the boat from being tripped up on the shoreline, and I think it probably adds a little bit more buoyancy at the back end, keeping it from being buried in the sand, and a few other things. We've been about 2 years since the conversation started, and we've got just this big stack of correspondence. Now, the main detail is that he really likes this transom right here on this particular boat. So we're going to try and build a boat using this specific transom. So one of my challenges is to try and extrapolate from this one image that I have of this boat to try and come up with the shape of that transom that's going to go onto our own. My client has found a whole bunch of boats that he particularly likes that all sort of fall into a similar category of a rowing wherry, and from that I plucked out a bunch of different lines that come closer to our Seabright skiff. So starting with the classic Chappelle boat here, this has really got just about the right kind of character that we're looking for. The overall dimensions of this particular Chappelle drawing are much bigger. This is a 23-foot boat. We're going to build what is essentially about a 15.5-foot boat. I think this one's a little different because this is really set up for sailing as opposed to the lifeguard work, but it's interesting to have a look at nonetheless. And of course, there you can see the box keel down here again. And here we've got a Piscataqua river wherry, and same proportions. It's got sort of a nice stem shape, and midship sections are kind of interesting to us in terms of the shape there. This is like a tombstone transom, so it comes straight down to the bottom. And then we have This one here, this is designed by Richard Colin for a salmon wherry. I imagine they have a few of these out at the Kama Beach facility, which is the Center for Wooden Boats over on Camano Island. Great little facility. If you're ever in that area, go visit it. Take a boat out for a row. I've done that a bunch of times. This is a pretty interesting little design, very similar to the Piscataqua River Wherry. Again, we have something that's sort of a similar to a tombstone transom, a little more character to it with this inside, this recurve to it here. So it's quite an attractive boat, and it's in the same size category as the one we want to build as well. So it shares a bunch of details that are very similar. So what I've done is I'm taken all of these drawings and sort of quickly made a note of the particular dimensions that are the major dimensions. So the depth of the bow, the depth of the transom, the depth of midships, the length and the beam, and I sort of just extrapolated the average from them. And of course the New York boat is so far out of the range of the rest, I made note of it, but it really doesn't apply to that average because it's too far out of whack. And I came up with sort of some averages, and from that I've come up with some very basic dimensions that we're going to use for our own boat. Now it's not that I'm using, like saying the average of these is the perfect boat, but it's a stepping off point. And interestingly enough, one other boat that I'm looking at is the Paul Gartside Bob. It's quite a different boat. I do believe this has a lot of its elements are related to the British flash boat. Turns out our dimensions come very similar to a lot of the elements in this boat as well, with the exception of beam. The beam in this boat is quite different, and the cross section of it I think is going to be quite different than ours. But it's a very interesting and beautiful boat, and he's got some really cool design features in terms of how the interior is laid out, which is a little different than average, and we might be just gleaning a little bit of inspiration from that. So I'm at the point where I'm ready to just start sketching out some lines. So that's what I'm going to do next. I'm just going to do, say, a 1 inch to the foot little scale drawing, which is not going to be precious by any means, but it's going to help develop just the general character of the boat. And I think from that I might just make a half model and then play around with the half model. And when we're happy with everything there, we'll look at expanding that into a larger set of lines that are closer to this scale, the 1.5 inches to the foot scale, which is a better working scale. This is just a sketch. This is just to get the ball rolling, get our head in the game. You know, maybe we put it to use and maybe we scrap it. First thing I think I want to do is establish the rocker. We probably want it a little flatter going aft, so flip that around. When it comes to shear lines, I don't like using sweeps. I'd rather use a ship's curve, because it just really allows me to sort of play around with it. So if I look at just those 3 points, right now I've got all manner of shape I can play with. So if you had a boat with a ton of flare, for instance, like a runabout, and you to create flare, you need more volume up here, so we bend that down, you get that recurved, flattened bow, but it affects things back here, as you see. See if I go up. See how this moves back here as I play around with that recurve? Now the stern's going to have a transom, so we don't want to give it too much sweep, but the bow coming to a point, we can give it more sweep. And the more beam you have up in the towards the bow, the more sweep you need to give it still, or else it's going to make the bow look like it's flattening out. And technically, the lowest portion sometimes looks a little bit better when it's about 3/5 of the way back from the bow rather than absolutely midships. Alright, that's not a terrible starting point, so let's just draw that in. Now let's see if we can figure out a stem profile. So I'm just eyeballing here. I think a slight rake right from the start. And we want to keep it fairly strong. Then we want a nice cutaway forefoot. So this is a beaching boat, so I like the idea of a beaching boat having not too hard a bow section. You don't want that digging into the sand. Okay, now there was much discussion about the transom rake. If I were looking at that drawing, my guess is it has a rake of about like that. I think we want to try and go a little bit more. Let's play around with that for now. Okay, and then another interesting thing I came up with was when I'm looking at this, that the transom height was 3/5 of the overall height. So let's see if we can't step that off here. Essentially from this point down it becomes a single plane, and from this point up we have transom shape. So if I look at that, I think I came up with a transom beam 27 inches. So let's see. So that would be the beam of our transom, and it looks like if I had to eyeball it, we have sort of a slight, not quite plumb first plank. Now can I even pull an angle off of here? I wonder. So let's do this. This angle should probably, I'm kind of guessing, should be the difference between these two relative angles we see. So we pick up this one, say 45 degrees. If we look at this one, we get like 66 degrees, 45, say 65. So right in between those, we get like 55 degrees. So let's call it that. We're going to go 55 degrees. See how that looks. Okay, that looks pretty darn good. I'd say that looks pretty darn good. And then I think this seems about right. And it looks like it's a real totally straight shot from there down. So I would say that is a reasonable sort of starting off point for this transom. Just going to delineate my parameters there. So I'm going to take that first plank width. I'm going to say that's probably going to be the same up at the bow, or close to it. So we'll bring that over. Shear planks are often a little bit wider, and this includes the rub rail as well. At the very least, shear plank can be something that just adds to the character of the drawing and gives you a little feel for what you're doing. So we'll start with that, and I feel like drawing in this one at the turn of the transom because that is kind of significant. There's our transom beam, so we'll draw that in first. We've got our stem, and I'm just going to eyeball the half breadth of the stem. And I know we want to go start with a 4-foot beam. We'll see if we need to widen that. So that up there. Okay, and I know we're going to do the keel, the plank keel is going to be a maximum width of 12 inches, so we'll throw that in too. So if the plank keel comes to about, that's probably going to come to about there, and we know it's going to come to here. So I'm just going to put this in with a sweep. now the half breadth of the boat. Again, we're going to pull that half beam out a little aft of the midpoint. You think about it, you're sitting roughly midships, so you kind of want your beam a little aft of that, just because that's where your oar locks are going to be, and you want a maximum beam at the oar locks. And now it's a question of how much volume do we want, just to have a bit of girth to it for rising to the swells without getting into too much of a cod's head mackerel tail shape. We've swollen past our beam there, which isn't a big deal. Maybe a little bit. Be about 50 inches wide, I think. I think that's a reasonably good start. So, the transom here, we can kind of sketch that in. It's probably something like that. Ooh, actually, nope, hold up. Gotta carry this there. That's where the transom goes to. Rookie mistake. Something like that. Okay, now that we've got sort of some very rough lines started, I think we're going to do just a midship section here. Normally we would sort of superimpose this on other areas, but I'm just going to do it separately for now. First thing I'm going to do is I'll just pick off the beam of my bottom here. So I'm going to pick off a height there. All right. So there's my shear height. We got a bottom, and now we'll get a beam in there. Okay, now it's just a question of what can we do with that shape. We want to keep some flair into this thing, so I don't want to go dead plumb. And maybe we want a little more meat. A bunch of sort of chin scratching going on here, so I don't know what I'm going to do here. I think I'll just leave this alone for the moment, and we'll come back in a few hours, look at it again, so to try and get a feel for what I like. So it's important to know what doesn't look good as it is to know what does look good. So here we've got version number 2, and the main thing I did on this one was I kicked the transom over to a 30-degree rake. This one, the other one was maybe 25 or something like that, and I gave the shear much more shape. So I left the stern where it was, but I brought the bow up an extra couple of inches. 26 inches or something like that. I've got about 3 inches of rocker fore and aft at each end. The bow I brought up just a hair. Punched out the beam just a tiny bit, so it's probably going to be about 50 inches wide overall. I started playing around with that transom shape, trying to dial it in a little bit better. Our goal has been to try and recreate this transom, and I kept playing around with trying to do it on the transom expansion, and then I was taking the transom expansion and I was converting it over to what it looks like in the rake profile, sort of doing the opposite of what we'd normally do with the transom expansion. And then I realized I should be doing it the other way around. I should be taking this shape, trying to eyeball it onto here as best I can, and then extrapolating it to what it would look like expanded, because that's what you normally do. And I don't know why it didn't occur to me to do it that way in the first place. And then let's move on to version number 3. So in this version, we are pretty much the same as number 2, but I just tried to clean things up a little bit more. I think I gave ourselves a little more meat in the bow area, just a scratch. The shear has been sort of tweaked a little bit more. I think I gave it, flattened it out ever so slightly in here to try and create a little bit more volume. Bow and stern are the same, transom rake is the same, and I tried to refine that transom shape just a little bit more because it was getting a bit muddy on the other drawing. Then the most significant thing I was playing around with here was the, we'll call it garboard plank. Now in this design, it's made up of 2 planks. And I'm building in plywood. I have a feeling I might be able to get away with doing it in 1 plank, and I'm not 100% about that, but it seems possible. So to that end, I've sort of described what it would look like if I drew in a plank line going from the base of that transom through to about the same height at the stem. I was looking at the lines for the accompanying drawing for this, and that seems to be how they did that boat. I'll show it to you. This is the Lincolnville Wherry, and we're not building the same boat. Ours is going to be fairly different in a bunch of ways, but the key thing I'm looking at here is the fact that if I follow that 1 plank line, it lands just about at the same height, and we can see that here in this drawing. There's that same line right there. So I've kind of playing around with that. And you can see how his planks here can take a sort of a hard bend there, so I should be conscious of that, because that might be fairly important in terms of trying to do this planking. It could be that I cannot easily get this to land down in 1 plank, and I kind of feel like maybe I should not try and do that, because that could just be a headache waiting to happen. As I was trying to work my way through figuring out the lines, I mean, I think it was in this one I tried throwing in a water line to work with in terms of trying to generate the lines, and then I realized as I was coming aft that water line wasn't telling me anything useful at all, because I knew this shape was going to be changing radically, so I had to abandon that approach. And the fact of the matter is I have no idea how to deal with trying to come up with this particular shape when we have this basically a crease that starts to occur at some point in the hull. So I went back and I watched this little video about building Seabright skiffs. It's a really cool little film. It's not very long, maybe half an hour, but it shows this guy who is building these things and his process. And what struck me is he's building this boat. He'll build a bottom just like you would with a dory. He'll fasten knees onto it and a stem onto it and a transom onto it. Build it on shores so that he pushes rocker into it, and then he just sets up like I think 2 or 3 molds, 1 midships and then 2 more of them. And I think what that is really telling me is this particular design is such a builder's design, not a designer's design. By that I mean somebody said, okay, we're going to build this like we usually do, but now instead of bringing this transom right down here, let's bring it up higher. And it's kind of like you're sculpting the boat in place. And trying to figure it out on paper ahead of time is almost silly, I'm thinking. So I'm kind of curious to know whether or not I should try and follow suit with that methodology. I don't know for sure, but I might try doing a model and see how that feels, because this is about as far as I'm going to take it right now. Present it to the customer named Joe, and we'll see what he says about this so far. This is not etched in stone. This is we'll call this our starting point. So from here on in, he'll either say, that looks great, and then we'll move on to sort of some of the finer details of trying to decide if we want this to be a little slacker in the bilge, a little fuller in the bilged. Maybe we want to change the shear line a little bit. I don't know. We'll see what he has to say, but this looks attractive to me as it is. Full disclosure, I kind of let Paul Gartside inspire me for this bow shape. He's got a very distinctive
sort of eye for certain shapes, and so I really like his stuff, and so I'm trying to nail that. And you know, it's funny, it's just a single curve, right? But you'd be surprised at how challenging it can be to try and tweak that curve into something that you like. So while I was at it, I kind of sketched in a stem and a stern knee. I think these are like way oversized for the drawing here, so we'll be chiseling those back. Another detail is Joe, he wants a stern post on the outside of the transom. So we'll be doing that, and we'll just basically let the transom knee kind of extend maybe almost all the way up. I'm not too sure. So I think I might just do a little half model from here just to play around with figuring out these relationships between topside planking and this funny little knuckle that we get when we create the box keel, because that's the big head scratcher for me. I've never done this. I have no idea how to do this. So it's kind of fun. It's kind of exciting that we got something different to play around with for a change. Well, we always have something different to play around with us. I don't know why I'm even saying that.
Okay, that's it for today, folks. I want to thank you all for watching, and I especially want to thank all of my followers on Patreon who make these videos possible. If you'd like to support this channel, you can do so by joining me over here on Patreon. Now, please join us again next time where we're going to get into a little bit of model making. See you later, folks.